Don't kill me, man! You wanna get nuts? Come on! Let's get nuts.
Hello guys, welcome back to Rewind Reviews. Today we're going all the way back to 1989 to get nuts. Today we're going to be talking about Batman. Directed by Tim Burton and written by Sam Hamm and Warren Scarron, this 1989 adaptation of the DC Comics superhero sees the Dark Knight of Gotham City beginning his war on crime, with his first major enemy being Jack Napier, a criminal who becomes the clownishly homicidal Joker. If you've been watching my channel since it began really, when I started doing proper movie reviews, you're probably aware that I am actually a fan of Batman, as you probably guessed from today's choice of shirts. You'd probably be a bit surprised to know that this isn't actually the first Batman movie that I actually watched. I'm not sure if it was Forever or might have been the Adam West movie, but one of those two. This was actually one of the last ones that I saw from the original movies before like the Christopher Nolan movies really sort of took off. So it was quite an interesting thing actually getting to experience this with the mindset of this is actually where it all started from. This is often hailed as one of the best Batman movies ever made, and it's such a strange concept to think that there was actually a point in time where people were really annoyed about the idea of this film, because it was a step away from the Adam West 60s show, so it was going a lot darker. We had Tim Burton taking over as the director. I don't know why people were against that, because that's actually a pretty good choice in my opinion. But then we also have Michael Keaton coming on as Batman, who up until this point in time was really only known for Beetlejuice and I think a few of his sitcoms. And then that's combined with the soundtrack from Prince, which again, I wasn't really a huge fan of Prince, and I've only really started like listening to his stuff a bit more recently, but I can definitely see what people were saying, because it is such a strange idea for a Prince soundtrack to be incorporated into a Batman movie. In fairness, if it came out today, it'd probably have like a needle drop moment where Batman's being knocked down and then as soon as he jumps up, next thing you know, Let's Go Crazy starts blasting in the background. That might actually make a pretty good intro, to be honest. Prince themed intro, avoid copyright. Sorry for going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I'm actually quite amazed that it seems to be like whenever I've uploaded a video and there's been a copyright claim of some kind, I haven't had like a proper copyright strike yet, but I have had a few little claims here and there, and all of them have all been Warner Brothers oriented, so I'm more than likely going to get one for this, but we'll wait and see. Should we talk about the movie now? Let's talk about the movie now. So, the movie stars Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson, Kim Basinger, Robert Wuhl, Pat Hingle, Billy D. Williams, Michael Gough, Jack Palance and Tracy Walter. So it's a pretty star-studded cast, and of course we have Michael Keaton, who is leading everything as Bruce Wayne and Batman. I don't know if I'll go so far as to say that Michael Keaton's my favourite interpretation of Batman, but he is definitely one of the best ones. He is really great in this role. He really manages to find a really good balance of both the human side of this character as well as the more supernatural. It's quite similar to what they did with the Batman 2022, because this is kind of like an early days Batman who's been around, he's sort of established himself enough that criminals are sort of aware of him, not necessarily to the extent that the Batman has done, but he is sort of a presence. He is like a bit of an urban legend in a way. I really like the way that Michael does play as Batman actually in the suit, because this is kind of the first time that we really see like the split between the two characters, because Batman is very quiet, he's very sturdy, and he's quite, you know, he doesn't really talk a lot. And then you have the Bruce Wayne who's quite awkward and he doesn't really seem too comfortable around people. But I think that sometimes they kind of play it up just a little bit too much, because there's a scene quite early on where you see him spending the night with Vicky Vale. He's lying in bed and he just sort of looks a bit uneasy being there, and the next thing you know it cuts to him hanging upside down like a bat. So I'm a bit split on that sort of decision. I like that they keep it quite mysterious around about what it is that sort of drives Batman, because that's actually quite a large part of the movie, which really does take you by surprise if you haven't seen this film before. And even though there is a mystery, it's not necessarily a detective story in the way that the Batman was and the animated series. They do have the detective elements in it, just not as prominent as you'd think. A lot of the detective work is really sort of off screen or done more by the journalists. But when it comes to the portrayal of Batman, he is really good, and I do really love Michael Keaton in this role. It is odd why they've given him glasses for Bruce Wayne, because does that mean he has to wear contact lenses when he's as Batman? But I mean, it's Clark Kent who wears the glasses, not Batman. When it comes to the more aggressive side of Batman, I am kind of surprised that, especially a lot of the more modern versions of Batman, especially like the Ben Affleck version, have sort of turned him into a bit of a killer, especially like a lot of the TV shows. And this is kind of the first one where he is, because he does flat out murder people in this. Unintentionally, people do end up sort of dying because of actions that he takes. Like, he ends up blowing up a building, people are inside it. It's a tricky situation for me to really sort of address this, because on the one hand it sort of goes against a little bit of this character, especially when it comes to who the villain is, the Joker, but at the same time it sort of fits this more gothic-y sort of tone and vibe that they've gone for. So I'm kind of split on this decision. It's never really established that Batman has this no-kill rule, but we as fans are sort of aware of it, so it's very split. But overall, I really do like him in this role. Then we get Kim Basinger playing Vicky Vale, who is a photographer working for this newspaper who's trying to uncover the mystery of the Batman. She is really good in this role. I do like what she brings to it. I think that it is quite strange having a Batman story that doesn't really focus on Batman that much, because majority of the movie does sort of take place around like her and the Joker. It seems more those two characters are like the main central characters, with Batman really being like a bit more of a mystery that needs to be solved throughout the film. So it is great that she gets a lot of screen time to really sort of develop the character a bit more, but I would have liked it if they just sort of toned down the screaming just a little bit. I suppose you are the normal person within this absolutely insane situation, so I don't really blame her, and I do think the performance overall is generally really good. One standout who I absolutely love in pretty much every interpretation of Batman movies is Alfred, who this time is played by Michael Goff. I really love this version of Alfred. I just love how he has connected with Bruce, and the way that he's not necessarily like a father to him, but he does look out for him, he does care for him, and I really love the relationship between the two of them. And I also think that Michael Goff is probably one of the funnier ones that we've got. I don't think we've ever actually had a bad Alfred. He is a really good character, and I do love that Michael Goff was able to not only come back for Batman Returns, but he is kind of the constant throughout the... I don't really know what to really class these movies as, like the original ones, or I don't really know what the official title is for anthology. Let's just stay with that. I like that he's the constant throughout the anthology series, so it is great seeing that this is where he kind of starts from. And then we have Robert Wuhl playing Alexander Knox, who is the reporter who's already sort of on the case of Batman. He's trying to uncover this mystery that these criminals keep talking about, and he could be an annoying character, especially the way that they sort of go with him, but I feel like it really does sort of balance quite well with the world that they've established, because he does have moments where he can be quite compassionate and he can be quite understanding, especially when it comes to Bruce Wayne and Vicky Vale, but he can be a little bit over the top at times, and he can be a bit of a jokester in a way. It's not my favourite character in the movie, but I do like his presence. Also, quite interestingly, we've got Billy D. Williams in this movie playing Harvey Dent, who, if you're familiar with Batman lore, Harvey Dent is Two-Face, and I think it is definitely an interesting casting choice, because I've only ever really seen Billy D. Williams as like Lando, so I'm more familiar with his nicer, happier personality. I've never really seen him do anything like really scary and dark, so I think that if they had done a Two-Face within the Burton movies, I was quite intrigued to see what they could have done with him, because I think this is a really interesting acting decision, and I think that Billy D. Williams could have been really good with it. But Two-Face isn't the villain of this movie. Oh no. This is one of the first big screen interpretations, definitely not the last interpretations of the Joker, this time played by Jack Nicholson. I love him in this role. He's very much a comic book character. He is very over the top, he's very funny, he's quite colourful, wears a lot of colourful clothing, which makes him like a really good contrast to this really dark, gritty world that they're all living in. Jack Nicholson is absolutely perfect for this role, and he's clearly having an absolute ball doing this. Similar with Michael Keaton, I wouldn't necessarily say that he's my favourite interpretation of this character, but I do think that he is one of the better ones that we have got. For me, I think he's like third place, and if Cameron Monaghan was technically the Joker, then I'll probably bump him down to fourth, but honestly he is definitely one of the best interpretations that we have got. When it comes to this version of the Joker, I like his motivation because he's basically kind of out for the people who wronged him, because they kind of set him up to get arrested or something early on, and he takes it out on like the criminals who are sort of like behind everything that's going on in Gotham. So a lot of it is revenge oriented, which is a bit different from what we really are familiar with from the Joker, but this is a different sort of interpretation of the character, and it does work very well for this film. But I think when it comes to Joker really sort of stepping up and becoming like a bit more of an absolute nutcase who's trying to just kill people, I think sometimes it takes it just a bit too far very fast. Like, the movie does jump forward in time quite quickly. I don't really know if I'm really on board with how fast he sort of like goes from like just going after the people who wronged him into like, let's just like gas the entire city. And since I mentioned it before, one of the things that I do think is kind of taken away from this movie is because Batman in many different interpretations is not a killer. He doesn't kill people, he doesn't use guns, anything like that. And the Joker is meant to be this character that pushes him as far as possible and tries to get him to cross that line, because that is the Joker's entire goal, to prove that everybody can turn into him if they have one really bad day. And there are elements of the killing joke in this, and it does work very well, it does play very well into the story, but because Batman doesn't really seem to have much of a problem really sort of just flat out killing people, it takes away from that big aspect of the Joker as the character that he's meant to be. So I am a little conflicted when it comes to some of the decisions that they do take in this film, because I am a fan of the character, I am a fan of the comics, and have grown up with a lot of different interpretations of this character, but I do really enjoy this interpretation, and I really do enjoy what Jack Nicholson really does do with this role. The story is really about these two freaks that have like inadvertently created each other, and it does work very well, and it is a really good sort of contrast showing how the two characters are pitted against each other, Batman and Joker. And when it comes to how the movie sort of focused, as I said before, it does focus quite heavily on the Joker and the Vicky Vale detective side of things, which works very well. And I think that it does build up the mystery of who the Batman is, because every interpretation since then has been completely focused on Bruce and Batman, and that's really been the only thing that we really sort of focus on. So it is quite clever having a different perspective on things, but it does mean that from a character arc standpoint there isn't really much of one for Batman Bruce, because he doesn't really change over the movie. The only thing that really sort of does change is how the public perceives him. I feel like that's the thing that DC movies tend to do a bit more of than Marvel, because Marvel seems to be more focused on characters and sort of building them up and them changing over time, whereas DC are more about like these legends that people just have to try and find a way of understanding and sort of accepting into the world. Characters like Superman and Batman are prime examples of that, because most versions of those characters, they don't really change over their movies, but the people around them do. The film kind of plays out like a crime thriller noir style story, and eventually sort of turns into a bit more of a comic book action movie. And it's one of the few times that a Batman project has managed to find a good balance of both the dark, gritty side of Gotham and the more light-hearted, over-the-top Batman elements that you might see in just like the comics. I feel like a large part of that does come from the visuals, because the way that Tim Burton does direct this movie, it does have that noir sort of feel to it, especially like everyone's wearing the trench coats and the hats. There's lots of shadows and just lots of, could almost see this in black and white. That's kind of how it's all styled and lit, and it does look great, and I love how it is portrayed in this movie. Gotham is this really grim, dirty, gothic styled place that you do not want to live in. I think this is probably the second best interpretation of Gotham that we have got. Up until the Batman came out, I would have said that this was my favourite interpretation, because it really does show the contrast of the nice way that it's kind of portrayed and the really horrible, dingy alleyways that you might not necessarily see, and it really does establish it really well, especially early on, because we have scenes where we've got like just a family just walking down a street and got all this stuff going on. It's a very lived in world. It definitely does feel like this is an already established place, and it's mostly sort of nice and all sort of lit up and everything, but then they take a turn and then they go down into an alleyway and there's muggers and they're all sort of like messed up and dirty and everything. And it's great how it is handled. That being said, I do think that this is one of the few times that I think that a Batman movie is kind of aged in a way that might not work too well. I will explain that, don't worry. What I'm trying to say is that when it comes to the overall style of the movie, majority of the Batman movies that we have had and TV shows could exist in any time. There's a lot of different eras that you can draw from when it comes to Batman, because especially like the animated series, for instance, there's a lot of things from the 80s, but then there's things from like the 50s, from the 20s, and like with a lot of the new ones there's a lot more modern stuff as well as previous timelines as well, and it works very well. But when it comes to this movie specifically, this is the most 80s oriented movie that we have got, to the point where especially like the makeup, the hair, the costumes and just the overall look, it just feels like a very 80s movie. And some people will say it is a bit dated, and I won't necessarily disagree with you, but it does work quite well for this film. And when it comes to the costumes, I do think that the overall looks that they've gone for, especially with Batman and Joker, they do look really good. I think this is probably the best costume that the Joker's had on screen. Heath Ledger's a close second, but I do think that it really does embrace the more comic booky elements that we have really sort of seen a decline in over the years. I think that the overall design of the Batsuit is really good. I would have liked it to have had a bit more of a grey sort of tinge to it, but it does look really good and it is visually iconic. This is one of the better interpretations of the Batsuit. The only issue is the neck, because this is the first time that we've really seen Batman in a movie where he can't turn his head, and that is purely down to the costume, because it's a complete cowl, so it comes all the way down from the jaw all the way down to the shoulders. So that means that Michael Keaton can't just like turn his head, he's just got to like move his eyes around, which does help the performance, because I do think that a big part of Batman comes from the eyes, because that's a good way of him sort of expressing like how he's feeling and things like that. And Michael Keaton does have the eyes for this as well. So yeah, I do like the design. I do think that the execution is just could have been tweaked a little bit, because I feel like the mask does seem like it's a little loose at times. I feel like that's something like they kind of fix in Batman Returns. So it is a really good costume. I think that it just needs a few little tweaks here and there. Are we ever going to see him wearing a blue cape? I mean, I'd just like to see that at least once. And then when it comes to like the makeup, for instance, so it definitely does add a lot to like the grimness and just the general like lack of like general hygiene that a lot of people seem to have in Gotham. But when it comes to like the Joker makeup, because the way that they've handled the Joker in this one, he isn't just like a red smile like we're more familiar with nowadays. This is like a proper comic book Joker, where the chemicals that he's kind of inhaled or sort of been dosed in has basically like forced his cheeks to like sort of go up into like this really horrible unnatural smile. And it's the only time that they've actually depicted this in a big screen movie. I really like how it is done. I think it is really creepy and kind of horrific, but kind of funny at the same time. So it does work really well. It does look great. There's quite a bit of action in this movie, and it really does help liven things up a lot, because this is a very crime-driven movie. But then we also have a lot of like the more action-oriented sequences, like the car chases and the sequence that Axis Chemicals, the scene with the balloons, the bell tower. There are some really good set pieces in this movie, and I do think that they are handled really well. They're not exactly intense, but they do. There's one thing that I did kind of notice, and that's like the sound design, because it's very cartoony sounds. Because I don't know whether this might have been like a reference to the 60s series, or if that was just the sound design that they wanted to go for, but it does have a very cartoony sound effects to it, especially with the batarangs got like and it's just little things like that. But the action is genuinely pretty good, and I do love the car chase, and I think the Batmobile is really great. I do love this interpretation of it. I think that sequence of the Batmobile like going through the forest with the Danny Elfman score in the background is absolutely brilliant. I also think it's kind of funny how the henchman who fights Batman in the bell tower, I think that fight is actually better than the Batman Bane fight from Batman and Robin. That's really bad. I do like how that sequence does incorporate quite a bit of humour to it as well, because we have all these henchmen sort of like trying to do like big intricate moves, and Batman just takes them out in one go. Like we've got the I think probably one of my favourite bits is when Batman sort of like moves around the bell tower, and one of the henchmen jumps out from a staircase from behind him, and the next thing you know he just misses completely and it goes straight through the floor. Even though this was out in the 80s and everything was very practical, there are still a few effects that they do use here and there. You've got like the painted backgrounds as well as models as well, and things like that actually work really well, and the models actually do look really great. I do think it makes things look very realistic. Those sequences of the bat plane going straight through the buildings trying to find the balloons, that still holds up really well. I genuinely love how that sequence plays out and how it looks, and like, even though there's no reason for it, the most iconic shot in any Batman movie ever made, when the bat plane goes up and then just stops in front of the moon before descending back to Earth, it's absolutely glorious moment. But the only scenes that I don't think really hold up are a lot of the green screen effects, because they just don't look right. There's plenty of scenes of people falling, the occasional background where it just doesn't look right, and I don't know what the reaction was at the time that the movie came out with, but I don't think that those sequences hold up as well as they do today. They don't take anything away from what you're feeling in those moments. I do feel like thematically they do still work and they do still hold up, but in terms of how they visually look, I don't think they're as good as they could be. Also, I'm sure there's like a couple moments where things are like animated, because there's an overhead shot of the city street, and you see Batman like standing on a glass roof, and you just see like the shadow of him like turns around and then disappears. I'm sure that's animated, because it just looks so weird. The music for this movie was composed by Danny Elfman, and this is probably one of the best Batman soundtracks that we've ever had. It is absolutely epic. It's so fitting for this interpretation of the character, and it's so iconic and well known that it's been adapted and sort of used in other interpretations over the years, because Batman the Animated Series and Mask of the Phantasm, they have that theme going through it. It is adapted by Shirley Walker. I believe did actually work on both Batman and Batman Returns, and I think she actually did add quite a lot to it, so I do think that she definitely deserves just as much credit, because she has done so much with that theme over the years. But then we've also got like the Lego games as well. The Batman theme is in there. A lot of the soundtrack from this movie are in those games, and even though it doesn't actually fit that interpretation, we do get a few little chords here and there in the theatrical cut of Justice League as well. It just goes to show how well known that this soundtrack is and how much it connected with Batman. And I honestly think that this is one of the best soundtracks that Danny Elfman has done. Danny Elfman has done so many superhero soundtracks over the years, with Batman Returns, the first two Spider-Man movies, he did Doctor Strange 2, he did Age of Ultron, he did Hellboy and Hulk. There's so many themes that he has done over the years, but I honestly would say that this is the best one that he has done. And this is coming from a bigger Spider-Man fan. And yes, as I said earlier on, there are a lot of songs that are incorporated into this movie, and they were created by Prince. And it is a really odd decision for them to have done that, because that just doesn't really sort of add up, especially if you have heard a lot of Prince's songs. But they actually do work very well in this. As I said, it isn't like anytime Batman shows up one of the songs plays. Most of his songs really sort of play during the Joker sequences, and they work really well. I do like how they are used in those scenes, because it does really sort of add to the more sort of fun, light-hearted side of this movie, especially with like the Joker like destroying this art gallery, and it's got that song playing in the background with him knocking over the statues and defacing all the paintings. Those songs do work well for those sequences, and I really do think that they add something to this movie. Batman 89 is a big stepping stone when it comes to superhero movies, because this is kind of one of the earliest like dark superhero movies that we got, and I feel like this is one that really sort of left as much of a lasting impression, because every Batman movie since that has tried to be dark, apart from the obvious ones. But I feel like most of them have sort of tried to emanate this in a way that I don't know if they've necessarily sort of recaptured this one, because I feel like this one's very stylized because of the way that Tim Burton handles things. But I do feel like this is the movie that really sort of cemented that Batman does work best when it's in a darker environment. For the most part, it does feel very accurate to a lot of the comics that were around about that time, especially things like the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns and Killing Joke and stuff like that. And it definitely does borrow a lot of the more darker elements of Batman, but it doesn't necessarily shy away from the more funny and light-hearted stuff. But there are definitely a few things that they do change from the comics, and for me it's never really bothered me too much. Again, there are a few little elements that I feel like does kind of take away from the character, especially when it comes to the relationship between Batman and Joker, because of the way that the Joker's really supposed to be when it comes to Batman. But most of the changes I don't necessarily mind. I am kind of split on, spoilers, the revelation of the Joker actually being the one who murdered Thomas and Martha Wayne. But it doesn't bother me too much, because it does fit this movie. It does kind of fit this alternate take on Batman. I do like how they have handled that, but as a fan I do understand the criticism. I do understand the people who aren't really happy with that decision, but overall that doesn't really bother me too much. Overall, I do think that this is still a really good movie. I think it mostly holds up very well. I think the performances, the music, the action, the story, the costumes, everything about this does work very well. It does add to this stylized version of Batman. I do really like this interpretation. It is a really good take on the origin story. I like how it doesn't necessarily just do the origin at the beginning and then sort of catch up years later. It's one of those movies that sort of takes its time and builds up the mystery around what it is that made Batman who he is. It's very quotable. I think the music and the songs are really iconic. They're so well known and memorable. Honestly, this is still a great movie, and for fans of superheroes, especially Batman, this is a must-see movie. For general audiences, I do recommend checking this out, because it is a really good film. I do think that there are a lot of things that you will enjoy in this. So with all that being said, my rating for this movie is going to be an 8 out of 10. Well, that's all I've pretty much got to say for today, so thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, share this out if you can. If you want to properly keep up to date with everything that's going on this channel, make sure that you hit the notification button to actually keep up to date on everything that is actually going on here. I'm also available on Facebook as well, so I do post out a few little updates and a few little tidbits and things like that over there. Let me know what you thought about the movie down below. Do you like it? Where would you rank this in terms of Batman movies? Where would you rank the interpretation of the Joker, the Batmobiles, everything that you like? Let me know down below, and tell me, you ever dance with the devil by the pale moonlight? I had to get that in somewhere, I'm sorry. I said this movie was really quotable, and I really didn't want to do too much quotes while I was doing this review, so I've done quite well to actually just do that one. And Bob, remember, you are my #1 guy. Thank you so much for watching, sorry about that. And I will see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.